the dust of redemption. New Mexico was a fine, red grit that got into everything: clothes, lungs, and the very soul of a man. It clung to the boots of Sealer's Way as he dismounted his bay mare, the leather creaking a familiar, weary song. He'd been riding for 3 days, chasing a phantom of a lead on a man who'd shot a bank teller in Santa Fe, and the only thing he'd found was a town that looked like it had given up the ghost years ago. The saloon, the Dusty Gulch, was a sagging structure with a painted sign that needed a fresh coat about 10 years back. A few men sat on the porch, their faces carved from the same red sandstone as the surrounding mesas, their eyes holding the flat, incurious stare of those who'd seen too much and cared too little. Sealer's own eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He noted the way the men's hands drifted toward their hips when he appeared, the subtle shift in their weight. He was used to it. He was a tall man, lean and whip-strong, with a face that was more about hard angles and a long, straight nose than any particular handsomeness. A faded scar cut a pale line from his temple down to his jawbone, a memento from a knife fight in a Laredo alley. He wore a black duster, travel-stained, and a low-crowned hat that shadowed his eyes. The Colt.45 on his right hip was worn low and tied down, the walnut grip smooth with age and use. He was a man who lived by a simple code, one that had cost him everything he ever loved, but one he couldn't seem to abandon. He tied his mare to the rail, giving her a pat on the neck. He needed a drink and a bed, maybe a hot meal if the cook was worth his salt. The sheriff of this town, if there was one, would be a problem for tomorrow. Right now, the trail was cold and his bones ached with a deep, familiar loneliness. The saloon doors groaned as he pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies. A few card games were in progress, the clinking of chips, a tinny counterpoint to a tinny piano being played by a man with a yellowing walrus mustache. The bartender, a bald man with a thick, sweaty neck, looked up, his eyes appraising the stranger. "Whiskey," Sealer said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the din. He slid a worn silver dollar onto the scarred mahogany bar. The bartender poured a generous measure into a cloudy glass. Sealers picked it up, the liquid burning a familiar path down his throat. He was about to ask about a room when the saloon doors burst open with a bang, letting in a swirl of red dust and the fading light of the afternoon sun. A man strode in, a bull of a man with a barrel chest and a thick, unkempt beard. He was trailed by 4 others, all rough-looking and armed. They didn't look like the townsfolk. They looked like the kind of men who did a town's dirtiest work. The leader, the bearded man, slammed a fist on the bar, making the bottles jump. "Whiskey, all around. Check," he bellowed. "We got a piece of business to celebrate." The bartender, Jake, nodded nervously and started pouring. Sealers watched the group in the mirror behind the bar. They were bristling with confidence, the kind that came from being the biggest bullies in the yard. One of the men, a weasel-faced fellow with a missing tooth, grinned, revealing a gap that made him look even more sinister. "Yep, old Sheriff's gonna be happy," the weasel-faced man said. He finally found a way to get the town's money back. The widow's gonna learn the price of her husband's foolishness. A cold knot tightened in Sealer's stomach. He didn't know the widow, didn't know her husband, but the word debt and the word widow in the same sentence with men like these was a recipe for a bad ending. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down, his movements deliberately slow. He stepped away from the bar, his boots making soft sounds on the sawdust-covered floor. He wanted to find a room, to get away from the tension that was suddenly so thick you could cut it with a knife. But as he walked to the door, he saw the crowd gathering outside. It was a subdued crowd, men and a few women, their faces grim. They parted as he approached, their eyes fixed on the street. And then he saw her. She was a young woman, perhaps 30, with honey blonde hair that had come undone from its bun and straggled around a face that was pale with terror. She wore a simple, threadbare dress of faded blue, and she was clutching a small, crying boy to her skirt. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, his face buried in the folds of her dress. The bearded man and his crew emerged from the saloon, swaggering. One of them was leading a horse, a massive dapple gray gelding with a mean eye. The horse was fitted with a heavy, braided leather quirt. "Mrs. Hart," the bearded man announced, his voice a theatrical bellow that carried across the silent street. "By the order of Sheriff Barnes and the Town Council of Redemption, you are hereby ordered to make good on the outstanding debt of your deceased husband, Mr. Obadiah Hart, the sum of $250, owed to the town treasury for goods and services provided." The widow, Eliza Hart, flinched as if she'd been slapped. Her voice, when she spoke, was a thin, reedy thing, barely a whisper. "I told the sheriff, I don't have that kind of money. Obadiah's store failed. We have nothing. I can't pay." "You're his wife," the bearded man said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "His debt is your debt. The town has been patient, Mrs. Hart, but our patience is at an end. Since you cannot pay in coin, you must pay in another way." He gestured to one of his men, who uncoiled a length of rope. Sealers felt his jaw clench. This wasn't about the money. It was about cruelty, about making an example of someone too weak to fight back. It was about power. Eliza Hart's eyes went wide with dawning horror. "No, please. I have the boy. Please, he's just a child. Don't do this here. Not in front of him." "Maybe the boy will remember," the weasel-faced man sneered. "Remember what happens to folks who don't pay their debts. It'll be a good lesson for him." The boy, sensing the danger, started to wail, a high, keening sound that tore at the heart. Eliza Hart tried to shield him, but one of the men roughly pulled him away, handing him to a woman in the crowd. The woman looked horrified, but she didn't refuse. Then 2 of them grabbed Eliza Hart by the arms. She struggled, but they were too strong. They dragged her to the hitching post in the middle of the street. One of them held her arms, while the other tied a rope around her wrists and threw the other end over the top of the post, pulling it tight so she was forced to stand on her tiptoes, her back exposed. The bearded man took the quirt from the man holding the horse. He ran his thumb over the braided leather, testing its weight. He looked at the crowd, a triumphant smirk on his face. He was in his element. "You all see," he announced. "This is the consequence of thievery and dishonesty. The town is owed, and the town will collect." He drew back his arm, and the braided leather quirt whistled through the air, landing with a sickening wet crack on Eliza Hart's back. A red line bloomed instantly through the thin fabric of her dress. She gasped, a choke-off sob, her body jerking with the impact. The boy in the crowd screamed for his mama. "That's one," the bearded man bellowed. He drew back his arm again. Sealers had seen enough. He'd seen too much. He'd seen the aftermath of Comanche raids, the burnt-out homesteads, the scalped bodies. He'd seen the casual cruelty of men in saloons, the killing done for a few dollars or a moment of anger. He'd seen the face of the man he'd loved, his younger brother, staring up at him with dead eyes after a card game went wrong, killed by a bullet meant for Sealers. He'd sworn then, in that hotel room in Dodge City, that he would never stand by and watch the innocent suffer. He'd thought it had made him a lone wolf, a man who carried a gun not for profit but for justice, but all he'd ever done was chase the ghosts of the dead. As the bearded man's arm came back for the second blow, Sealer stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He simply walked into the middle of the street, his boots scuffing the dust, his presence a sudden, silent force that commanded attention. He stopped a few feet from the hitching post. He didn't look at the bearded man, but at the whip in his hand. "No more," Sealers said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the boys' wailing and the tension in the air like a knife. The bearded man froze, his arms still in the air. He turned, his piggy little eyes narrowing as they focused on Sealers. The men holding the widow looked up, their hands moving toward their own guns. "Who the hell are you?" the bearded man snarled, his eyes flicking from Sealers' unassuming duster to the long-barreled Colt on his hip. He saw it then, the quickness of the drawl that was a language spoken only by the men who lived by the gun. This wasn't a farmer or a shopkeeper. This was a killer. "I'm the one telling you to stop," Sealers said, his voice still calm, his body still loose. "You've made your point. Let her go." "This is town business, stranger," the bearded man said, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. "The sheriff ordered it. You'd best get on your horse and ride out while you still can." "I'm not riding anywhere," Sealers said. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. "I said, no more. Untie her." The man holding the rope hesitated, looking at his boss. The bearded man's face was reddening with anger, but he wasn't a fool. He could feel the coiled tension in this stranger, the absolute stillness that preceded a storm. He was a bully, and bullies rarely know what to do when they meet someone who isn't afraid of them. "You're making a mistake, stranger," the bearded man said, his voice dropping an octave. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Sheriff Barnes is a powerful man." "I don't give a damn about your sheriff," Sealers said, his gaze never leaving the bearded man's. "I'm giving you a choice. Untie the lady, or I'll make you wish you had." The weasel-faced man behind him laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "There's 5 of us." "You fool, you're outnumbered." "Funny," Sealers said, a cold smile touching his lips. "I've counted 6 of you. Must have lost my head." He was counting the men in the street, the ones on the porch, the weasel-faced one, the bearded one, the 2 holding the widow, the one holding the horse. That was 5. The 6th was a man who had been leaning against the general store, a thin, reedy man with a shotgun. They were all waiting for a sign, for the bearded man to give the order. The bearded man's hand twitched towards his own gun. It was a move he'd made 100 times, a move that had intimidated men who'd played cards with him. But he was slow. He was a town bully, not a man who lived by the draw. Sealers was faster. He'd have to be. He was outnumbered, and if he hesitated even for a second, he'd be dead. The bearded man's fingers brushed the butt of his revolver. The sound that followed was a single, deafening roar. It wasn't Sealers' Colt. It was the sudden, shocking blast of a shotgun from the general store. The blast tore a chunk out of the hitching post, splintering the wood and sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The bearded man, startled by the unexpected noise, flinched, his hand freezing on his gun. But Sealers didn't flinch. He had expected the move. In a heartbeat of confusion, his own hand was a blur of motion. The Colt cleared leather, its barrel gleaming dully in the afternoon light. He didn't fire. He stood there, the hammer cocked, the weapon aimed squarely at the bearded man's chest. "Your move," Sealers said. "Tell the man with the shotgun to put it down, or I'll put you down first." The silence was absolute. The only sound was the ragged breathing of Eliza Hart, the boy's hiccuping sobs, and the low nicker of the horse. The bearded man's face had gone white. He was staring down the black moor of the Colt, and he saw his own death staring back at him. He knew with the certainty of a man who had seen death before that the stranger would not miss. The men on the porch had gone still, their own hands frozen. The man with the shotgun, realizing he'd been made, slowly, carefully, lowered the weapon. "Now cut her down," Sealers ordered, his voice never wavering. "All of you, take your horses and ride. If you're still here when I'm done, I'll take it as an invitation to keep this conversation going." The man holding the rope swallowed nervously and fumbled with the knot. It came undone, and Eliza's heart collapsed, sobbing into the dust. One of her captors backed away, his hands held high. The weasel-faced man was already moving toward his horse, not wanting to be anywhere near the epicenter when the next tremor hit. The bearded man stared at Sealers for a long moment. The hate in his eyes was palpable. He was defeated, and he knew it. He began to back away, his hands held out in front of him. "This isn't over," he spat. "The sheriff will hear about this." "You tell him," Sealers said, his voice flat. "Tell him I'm staying at the Dusty Gulch. Tell him I'll be waiting. And tell him if he sends men to intimidate a widow and a child again, I won't be so polite." The bearded man, his eyes full of murder, turned and stumbled toward his horse. The rest of his men scrambled to follow, not looking back. They mounted up and rode out of town in a cloud of dust, leaving the stunned silence of redemption behind them. Sealers holstered his weapon. The weight of it felt heavy, as it always did after a confrontation. He turned to find Eliza Hart on her knees in the street, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The woman who had taken the boy let him go, and he ran to his mother, throwing his arms around her neck. Sealers approached them, his movements slow and non-threatening. He bent down and gently took her arm. "Ma'am, you need to get up. You need to get inside." He glanced at the man who had fired the shotgun, the one from the general store. He was a thin, nervous-looking man with a receding hairline. He was holding the shotgun with trembling hands. "You," Sealers said, "can you help her?" The man nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I'm Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper. I couldn't stand by and watch. I didn't want to see that happen to Eliza. She is a good woman, a good mother. Obadiah was my friend." "Then help me get her to your store," Sealers said. Together, they helped the dazed and trembling woman to her feet. She was still crying, clinging to her son with one arm. Sealers led them across the street and into the cool dimness of the general store. Mr. Henderson closed the door behind them, shutting out the curious and frightened stares of the townsfolk. "Can I get you some water, Eliza?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, her face still buried in her son's hair. "Yes, please, Mr. Henderson. Thank you." Sealers stood by the door, his eyes scanning the street through the dusty window. He saw the people dispersing, the shock of what had happened evident on their faces, the power of the sheriff. The fear that had held them in its grip had been challenged. He didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Mr. Henderson returned with a tin cup of water. Eliza Hart drank it greedily, her hand trembling. The boy had quieted, his eyes wide and dark, watching Sealers. The child was scared of him, Sealers realized. He was just another stranger, another source of violence in his young life. Sealers took a step back, putting some distance between himself and the family. He didn't want to frighten them further. "I'm sorry you had to see that, ma'am," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. Her gaze was different now, not just of terror, but of confusion. Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Sealers Wade," he said. "I'm just a man passing through." "Well, you just saved my life," she said, her voice trembling with a new emotion, something like gratitude mixed with the residual shock. "And for that, I am in your debt. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "You don't owe me a thing," Sealers said, his tone firm. "I just don't abide by that kind of thing. I've seen enough of it to last a lifetime." Eliza Hart was a proud woman. That much was clear from the way she straightened her shoulders despite the pain and the shame of the public spectacle. My husband, Obadiah, he owed some money to the town. He was a good man, a hard worker, but his start just couldn't compete with the big outfit from Tucson. The drought 2 years ago killed us, and then he got sick. The doctor's bills, they just piled up. Sheriff Barnes, he said he'd give him time, but then Obadiah died, and the sheriff said the debt was mine. That's not how the law works, Sealers said. A debt dies with the man who owes it. You're not responsible for his debts. I know that, she said, a tear sliding down her cheek, but he has a judge in his pocket. He's been wanting the land our house is on for years since Obadiah's father first homesteaded it. He thought by putting me in a position of despair, I'd sell it to him for a fraction of its worth. I wouldn't, so he decided to make an example of me. He wanted to break my spirit, to humiliate me so much that I would have no choice but to leave. She looked at Sealers, her eyes pleading. I can't leave. This is my home. It was my husband's home, and his father's before him. It's all my son has. Sealers felt a familiar anger stir inside him. It was the same anger that had been his constant companion for years. The corruption of men in power, the way they preyed on the weak, the way the law, the justice he'd once believed in, could be twisted to serve the whims of the powerful. He felt a kinship with this woman, this widow who was fighting for the only thing she had left in the world. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "I have no money, no family left. My mother died a few years back, and my father died when I was a child. I have no one." "Yes, you do, Mr. Henderson said, stepping forward. "You have me, and you have the whole town, Eliza." We were just too afraid to stand up to him, but not anymore, not now, not after seeing what that man did, and seeing this stranger stand up for you. Eliza looked at Sealers, her eyes filled with a desperate hope. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice catching. "Please. They'll just come back. The sheriff will be furious. He won't stop. You've put yourself in danger for us. Please, Mr. Wade, I don't want to see you get hurt because of me." "I don't plan on getting hurt, ma'am," Sealers said. "I'll stay for a while, at least until I'm sure this is settled." He didn't tell her that he had nowhere else to go. He didn't tell her that the trail he was following had gone cold, or that the men he was looking for were probably long gone, or that the real reason he kept moving was that staying in one place always made him feel the weight of his own ghosts. He stayed because it was the right thing to do. It was the only thing he knew how to do. The next few days were tense. Sheriff Barnes didn't come, but his presence was felt everywhere. The men who'd attacked Eliza Hart were seen in the saloon, their eyes full of venom. They didn't start anything, not while Sealers was walking the streets, but the threat was there, a palpable darkness hanging over the town. Sealers stayed in the small room above the general store, a room Mr. Henderson had cleared out for him. He spent his days helping the storekeeper and watching the streets, his body a coiled spring, his mind working through scenarios. He knew a showdown was coming. He'd been in enough of them to know the signs. It was just a matter of when. He spent his evenings with Eliza and her son, a boy named Thomas. At first, the boy was wary of him, hiding behind his mother's skirts. But Sealers had a way with children born of his own lost youth, perhaps. He showed Thomas how to whittle a piece of wood into a simple whistle, and the boy's shy smile was a balm on Sealers's weary soul. He'd forgotten how good it felt to see a child laugh. Eliza Hart was a different story. She was quiet and resilient, her grief for her husband still a raw wound. She was grateful, but there was a sadness in her eyes that no amount of gratitude could erase. Sealers found himself drawn to her strength, her quiet dignity. He talked to her about her husband, about her dreams for the future, about the small moments of happiness in her life before the tragedy. He didn't talk about his own past. That door was locked, and he wasn't sure he had the key anymore. He just knew that for the first time in a long time he felt like he was part of something, a part of a community, a part of a family, however fragile and temporary. On the third night, the storm finally broke. It was a moonless night, the stars blotted out by clouds that had been gathering all day. Sailors was in his room cleaning his coat with a practiced, methodical rhythm when he heard the sound of horses. It was the muted thunder of many hooves, not the casual arrival of a few riders. He rose from the bed, his senses on high alert. He moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. 6 riders were dismounting in front of the sheriff's office, which was just a small building a few doors down from the dusty gulch. They were all armed, and their faces were hidden by bandanas. They didn't look like town ruffians, they looked like professional gunmen. The kind of hired killers that big ranchers and corrupt politicians used to do their dirty work. The sheriff was with them. He was a portly man with a thick gray mustache and a shiny badge on his vest. He was giving orders, pointing at the general store. Sealers pulled on his boots and strapped on his gun belt. He knew this was it. He'd been expecting it. The sheriff had had enough time to hire men from the next town over, maybe even from Tucson. He was trying to make it look like a random attack, a band of outlaws riding in and killing a stranger. He was clever. This sheriff. He was using the fear in the town to his advantage. Sealers moved down the stairs, his steps silent. The store was dark. Mr. Henderson was probably asleep in the back room. Sealers didn't want him or Eliza to be involved. He had to handle this himself. He slipped out the back door, into the narrow alley. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of rain. He could hear the men in the street, their low voices. He made his way along the edge of the buildings, his figure a ghost in the shadows. He was outnumbered, 6 men against 1, and he knew some of them were seasoned fighters. This was like facing the town bully and his 5 friends. This was like facing men who would kill without hesitation. For a fleeting moment, he felt a familiar pang of regret, a longing for a simpler life. Then he pushed it aside. He reached the corner of the general store and peered around. The 6 men were spread out in a semicircle around the front of the store. Their guns out, they were waiting for him. They knew he was staying there. The sheriff was standing near the hitching post, his hands on his hips, looking smug. They were about to call him out, to force him into a firefight in the middle of the street. He could make a run for it. He could slip away into the desert and let the town handle its own problems. He could go back to his life of chasing ghosts, of being a lone wolf. He'd done it before. He'd walked away from other towns, other people. It was easier that way. It was safer. But as he was thinking it, he saw a flicker of movement in the window of Eliza Hart's house, which was just across the street from the store. A candle flickered, and he saw her face for just a moment, pale in the dim light. She was watching him. She knew what was happening. She was terrified for him. The thought of leaving her to the mercy of these men, of letting the sheriff take her land and break her spirit, was unacceptable. He couldn't do it. He couldn't stand by and watch another innocent person suffer. Not again. Not after Lerdo. Not after his brother. He took a deep breath, stilling himself. He stepped out from the shadow of the general store, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He walked into the middle of the street, directly between the men and Eliza Hart's house. He stopped, his hands at his sides, his stance loose and ready. The men, startled by his sudden appearance, turned to face him. The sheriff's face went white with shock. He hadn't expected Sealers to just walk out. Well, the sheriff said, recovering his composure. If it isn't the stranger with the big ideas. You're a fool, mister. You should have ridden out when you had the chance. I don't ride away from a fight, Sheriff, Sealers said, his voice calm and clear. I told your man 3 days ago I'd be waiting. I'm a man of my word. "You're a dead man," one of the hired guns said, a tall, lean man with a scar that bisected his eyebrow. "You got one gun. We got 6. I'd make your peace if I was you." "I've been making my peace for a long time now," Sealers said, "but I'm not in the habit of giving a man my name and the time of day without knowing who he is. You boys are a long way from Tucson. I'd wager this ain't your fight." The tall man's eyes narrowed. He clearly recognized a fellow gunman. "The sheriff pays well," he said. "That's all that matters." "The sheriff is a bully and a tyrant," Sealers said, his voice rising so the whole street could hear. "He's trying to steal a widow's land. He's threatened her, had her whipped in the street in front of her son, and now he's brought in hired killers to murder a man who stood up to him. Is that the kind of law you want to serve?" "Enough talk," the sheriff shouted, his voice cracking with anger. "I came here to clean up this town. You think you can come in here and judge me? I'm the law in redemption. You're just a drifter, a killer. No one will miss you when you're dead." The hired guns looked at each other, uncertain. They didn't care about the widow or her land. They cared about money, but they also cared about their own hides. Sealers could see the calculation in their eyes. "You've made a threat against a citizen of this town," Sealers continued, his voice unwavering. "That makes you the outlaw. Sheriff, I'll give you one chance to back down. Take your men and your money and leave redemption. If you do, we'll call it even." The sheriff laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Even? There's no even with me, stranger. I don't negotiate with scum like you. Boys, take him. Shoot him where he stands." The tall gunman raised his pistol, but he didn't fire. He was waiting for Sealers to make the first move. The other men did the same. The tension in the air was so thick you could taste it. Sealers felt a strange calm descend upon him. It was the calm before the storm, the moment of absolute clarity that came to a man who knew he was about to face death. He'd felt it before in the Civil War, in the skirmishes with the Comanche, in the bloody saloons of the frontier. It was a moment of pure, crystalline focus. He heard a soft sound, a window sliding open, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mr. Henderson in his long johns, holding his shotgun, aiming it from the general store. He saw another man, the blacksmith, standing in the doorway of his forge with his sledgehammer. They were going to help him. The people of redemption were finally standing up. And then the shot was fired. It wasn't from Sealers' gun, or from the guns of the hired killers. It came from the crowd, a single rifle shot from a rooftop. The bullet struck the tall gunman in the shoulder, sending him spinning. In that fraction of a second, all hell broke loose. Sealers' hand was a blur. His Colt roared in the night, a muzzle flash illuminating his face. The hired gun next to the tall man crumpled, a dark hole appearing in his chest. Sealers dove to the side as a volley of bullets ripped through the air where he'd been standing. He rolled, came up on one knee, and fired again, and another man fell, clutching his throat. The street erupted in a chaos of sound and light. There were shots coming from the general store, from the rooftops, from the windows of the houses. The townsfolk, their courage finally ignited, were fighting back. The hired killers were caught in a crossfire. They were good, but they weren't prepared for a full-scale war. Sealers took out another man, his shots precise, deadly. He saw the sheriff scrambling for his horse, his face a mask of terror. The last hired gun was trying to run, but a blast from Mr. Henderson's shotgun took him in the leg, sending him sprawling. It was over in less than a minute. The street was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the groans of the wounded, and the whinnying of terrified horses. The hired killers were dead or dying. The sheriff was trying to mount his horse, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't get his foot in the stirrup. Sealers walked up to him, his Colt still smoking in his hand. He grabbed the sheriff by the collar of his vest and yanked him off his horse. throwing him into the dust. The man was a coward, just like all the others. "You're under arrest, Sheriff," Sealers said, "for kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. The people of Redemption will see you hang." The sheriff groaned, his body shaking. "You can't do this. On the law." "Not anymore," Sealers said. He looked around at the crowd of people who had come out of their homes. They were pale, their faces covered in gunpowder, but their eyes were bright with a newfound defiance. "Is there anyone here with a set of keys to the jail?" The door of Eliza Hart's house flew open, and she ran out, her hair wild, her eyes full of fear. "Sealers, are you all right?" He turned to her, his body suddenly feeling the weight of 1,000 bruises and the exhaustion of the fight. His shoulder ached from where a bullet had grazed it, and he could feel the trickle of blood down his arm. He nodded, trying to smile. "I'm fine. It's over." She rushed to him, her hands fluttering over him, her eyes searching for wounds. He winced slightly as her fingers touched his arm. "You're hurt," she said, her voice full of concern. "It's just a scratch," he said. "It'll heal." He looked at the townsfolk. They were standing together, no longer afraid. They had faced their own demons and had won. They had taken their town back. The next few hours were a blur of activity. The bodies were removed. The sheriff was locked in his own jail, awaiting a judge from Santa Fe. The injured were tended to. Sealers let Mrs. Hart patch up his arm in her small, simple house while little Thomas slept in the other room. She worked in silence, her gentle hands cleaning the wound and bandaging it. He watched her face, her concentration, the slight frown of worry that creased her brow. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for what you did tonight, for what you did for all of us. I told you. You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said, her voice soft, "but I owe you my home. I owe you my son's future. That's not nothing." He looked at her, at the strength and the vulnerability in her eyes. He felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight knot that had been in his chest for years. He felt a connection to this woman, to this place. He felt for the first time in a long time that he might have a place here. He stayed in Redemption. He didn't say he was staying forever, not then. He helped the people rebuild their confidence. He became a deputy, working with a newly elected, honest sheriff. He helped Eliza Hart get her husband's store running again, using the skills of a frontier businessman he'd acquired in a dozen different towns. He taught Thomas how to ride and shoot, not for violence, but for protection and for the sheer joy of it. A year later, on a warm spring evening, he was sitting on the porch of the house he was building a few plots away from Eliza's. He watched as she walked out into the yard, her blonde hair now streaked with gray, a calm smile on her face. She was holding a small bundle in her arms. It was a baby girl born just a few weeks ago, with eyes as blue as the winter sky. He got up and walked over to her, taking the baby into his arms with a gentleness that belied his calloused hands. He looked down at the tiny face, so innocent and full of potential, a future he had helped to create. "You know," he said, looking at Eliza, "I wasn't looking for a home. I was just passing through. Like I always was. I didn't think I had anything left to give." "You were wrong," she said, her voice soft. "You gave us everything." He looked at her, at the house, at the town that had risen from its ashes. He wasn't a lone wolf anymore. He was a husband, a father, a man who was finally at peace. He'd come to a town called Redemption looking for a ghost and had found his own.